Hi guys, today we are going to do a refresher lesson about primary sources. So I know primary sources are something that we have used in class plenty of times. However, they have been a challenge for most people just about every time we've used them. So I wanted to take this week to remind us about what primary sources are, and then in the second lesson for this week, give you some reading strategies. The reason I'm doing this is your whole last 5 weeks of school are going to be dedicated to a primary source project where you are looking at primary sources from the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and then using those as inspiration to create your own primary source, detailing what life is like in April and May of 2020. So to get us started, I want to talk about what a primary source is. So this definition is from the University of Massachusetts at Boston. And they say primary sources are immediate firsthand accounts of a topic from people who had a direct connection with it. That seems like a pretty straightforward definition. However, it really trips people up when they're trying to determine the difference between a primary and a secondary source, because a lot of times people confuse the word for primary as meaning the most important or the most used source. In reality, primary in this instance means the first or the original source. So a primary source is from someone who actually lived through the experience. There's a couple other different ways that we can help to determine the difference between primary and secondary sources as well. So primary sources, just because they were from someone who had firsthand experience, doesn't mean they had to be written at that exact moment. A lot of primary sources that we've studied in class were not written as the same exact thing was happening. So for example, there weren't people during the Civil War sitting writing out a minute-by-minute update most of the time. The letters that they wrote or the journal entries that they wrote were something that they wrote when they were reflecting back on the events of a day or a week or a month. So that means that autobiographies or poems or songs can also be primary sources, even if they happen a couple years or decades after an actual event occurred. So that means that secondary sources are not identified by the time that they were written, but in how they were written or how they were created. So secondary sources can be identified as secondary because they are taking and summarizing or remixing or rephrasing information taken from a primary source. Secondary sources are usually summaries of a large amount of information, whereas primary sources are more narrow and focused. So a good example of a secondary source would be a textbook or a lecture from someone like myself teaching you about history. So for example, when we were learning about the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution, my secondary source was the PowerPoint presentation I did with you. The primary sources I borrowed from, however, were very varied, and there were a lot of them. So there were some diary entries from people on both sides of the conflict. There were images. There were poems and songs written. And I took all of that, each little narrow thing, and I put them together to do a nice broad presentation. Another thing that could make it easier to help you determine the difference between a primary and secondary source is being reminded of the types of documents or the types of things that can be primary sources. So as the week goes on, we are going to look more in depth at different types of primary sources, but this is just going to be an overview of the big ones. So one of the main primary source types is photographs. Unfortunately, we study a time in history where there wasn't photography up until the Civil War. So I really typically love to show photographs from Matthew Brady, who was a Civil War photographer in class. But since we aren't together physically at school, we'll just have to do this presentation and then another lesson next week about images from the Civil War. Images as a primary source are really interesting to me because they capture the moment as it was. Now, even in the 1800s, during the time of the Civil War, photos could be manipulated. They didn't have Photoshop, but they had their own little tricks when they were developing photos. So just like with any primary source or any source of information, we should be careful about how reliable we think something is, and we should always compare it with other sources. However, more often than not, photographs from history really do capture the moment as it was. It gives us a very obviously realistic view of life in that moment. It also can show us what people at that time looked like, what their living conditions look like, and it also gives us a good hint about what technology was like. This photo that is an example on the presentation is obviously not as good of quality as even your phone camera would be today. Another type of primary source, and this time one that we've actually seen a lot of in class, are political or commentary cartoons. I think political or commentary cartoons are an interesting type of primary source because they're just about the only primary source that we can look at and know for sure that there was bias included when it was created. So remember, bias is if you are trying to promote one side or one opinion over the other. So for example, in this political cartoon, you see Abraham Lincoln right here saying no peace without abolition, and then Jefferson Davis saying no peace without separation. And between them, they are fighting over the United States. Now, if you haven't learned yet, Abraham Lincoln was our president during the Civil War. However, what you might not know is that Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln, president of the Union, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. Both men obviously wanted very different things for their citizens. That's why we had the Union and the Confederacy, and our country had essentially split in two. Abraham Lincoln is promoting abolition or the end of slavery, and Jefferson Davis is saying separation because he believes that the South and states in the South should have the right to make their own decision in terms of continuing the practice of slavery. In the middle, we have a representation of General George McClellan, and he is saying the Union must be preserved at all hazards or all costs. Basically saying we need to get over this because our country being united is far more important than the issue of slavery. So just in this one political cartoon, we're seeing 3 different popular political opinions of the time. Another type of primary source that I really love looking at is art. Now, even though we've looked at a lot of drawings and paintings in class, I would also like to take this moment to explain that primary sources of art can also be sculptures or pottery. They can be jewelry. There's a lot of different things that art can include. I also really like art because it allows viewers to go where a camera didn't exist or into intimate moments that an artist might be remembering after the fact. It can also allow the creator to illustrate a moment that maybe didn't happen directly in front of them, but represents the culture or the political climate of the time. So this painting, A Visit from the Old Mistress from 1876, about a decade after the Civil War, is a good example of capturing a moment that might not have happened exactly like this, but definitely happened in a similar way. So in this painting, you'll see 4 Black women who were formerly enslaved, and they are, for the first time, coming across a white woman who used to be the slaveholder that owned them. Now, at the time, if they had still been enslaved, they would have had to be overly polite to her. They would have had to call her ma'am. They would have had to refer to her as the mistress of the home, and they definitely would not have been allowed to stay seated when they came across her. However, now that they are freed from enslavement, they are allowed to act like they would if they came across any other person that had wronged them in that way. They no longer have to be overly polite or kind to someone who denied them their humanity. So this painting does a really good job of showing the tension and kind of the pain that happened even after the end of the Civil War as people were adapting to a new way of life. Another type of primary source are written documents, and this is a huge category. Written documents can be journals, diaries, books. They can be laws or things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I would say more often than not, they are the hardest type of primary source to read because they are usually written in a language that is not familiar to us. Even though it says it's English, it is a very different type of English than we use today. So an example of a written document like the ones that we've used in class more frequently is the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a political document that was issued by President Abraham Lincoln in September of 1862. However, it didn't go into effect until January of 1863. It was supposed to be an order that said that all enslaved people in the Confederate States would be allowed to be free. So this is a good example of how a primary source, although not being dishonest or biased, might not tell the full story. So if I were studying history and I only read the Emancipation Proclamation, I would probably think this was pretty awesome. It's going to end slavery. It's going to allow enslaved people to be free. But in reality, as someone who has studied history more fully, I've read diary entries, I have read books and seen other things that came about from this time period, and I've seen the other side of it, which is that many Northerners still own slaves at this time because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to them. I also know that the Emancipation Proclamation was basically useless in the South because they had their own government and their own president, President Jefferson Davis. So why would they listen to Abraham Lincoln? So on the surface, the Emancipation Proclamation tells us a little bit of the story, but when we dig deeper and look at other written documents from the time, we can see more fully what was actually happening in history at the time. Another type of written primary source is written communication. Today, written communication looks really different. We don't usually write letters anymore. If you do, that's awesome. We can also send text messages or emails, direct messages. Those are all different types of written communication that can be used as a primary source. Written communication is an interesting primary source type to look at because it gives us a really private view of people's lives. Thinking about like the texts or the emails that you send or the direct messages you send, you don't typically think that they are going to be seen by a large group of people. And the same was the case for letters that were written during times like the Civil War. It gives us a really private view of what life was like for people when they felt like they didn't have to filter themselves. Another thing that we can learn from written communication is, again, going back to what kind of technology existed. Before the Civil War, the U.S. Postal Service believed that people sent only about 5 letters per year on average. However, during the Civil War and directly after, each person in the country was writing an average of 25 letters in a year. So that is a 5-time increase of the number of letters being written. And that can also show us that people were further apart and that they had more access to public education to learn how to read and write. Another type of primary source that we can rely on is the category of news and advertisements. So on this slide, I have 3 different advertisements trying to convince people to join the Civil War efforts. So this one, it kind of has 2 parts to it. So the first, the ads that you see above are definitely something that were meant to be biased. They were meant to persuade people to want to join the Army, and that's true for basically any kind of ad you see. Ads or advertisements as a primary source allowed us to see the technology of the time or the jobs that existed. Basically, just anything you could spend your money on or get paid to do, advertisements can tell us about it. However, we always have to know that they're not telling the full story because people won't buy something or do a job that doesn't sound good. On the other hand, we have news stories, which we are more likely to just believe are reliable and trustworthy. However, we should remain aware that even though journalists typically try to remain neutral and tell the full story as factually as possible, they are still humans. And people have more natural bias than we'd like to admit. So even news stories from history should be read and compared to other news stories, just like you'd do today if you were reading about something happening in the world around you. The next type of history I'm going to talk about is spoken history. This can include interviews or storytelling. Spoken history is actually the oldest form of history, and it is how for decades and centuries we were able to pass on information from generation to generation. So this clip that I'm going to play for you is like just really tiny snippets. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation when I was talking about photography, how there weren't videos really because the technology didn't exist. It was also very hard to record and preserve audio for a lot of the early 1900s, which is when many of these interviews happened. So the clips that I have are really short. So I'm going to play those really quick and then explain how spoken history can kind of play into primary sources.
January 12th, 1999.
My name is Hampton Hughes. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson, and now I am 101 years old.
They are voices that break a silence.
We were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows.
Witnesses to a time we only know from photographs and the written word. But they were there.
We said all that, stood on that picket fence all day long between them soldiers going back to silent zones, different places. Colored soldiers in Georgia.
Born to slavery.
We didn't have no property. We didn't have no home.
And now we can hear them speak.
Because
So spoken history to me is really valuable because it captures the personality of the person telling it. It is uniquely human and personal. When we write things down, we have more time to think about them and change them and fancy them up and make them sound really polished. Whereas an interview or a storytelling session that's been recorded seems more human. It gives us people's personality. It allows us to hear how they would word things if they weren't filtered. And it gives us that different kind of element than just reading something on a page. So spoken history to me is a lot of fun to listen to, and I wish we had more of it from that time period. So you might have noticed that one of the first men that they played a clip of said he was 101 years old. So obviously this audio recording came far after the end of the Civil War, but is a good example of how something decades after an event can still be a primary source. That man is not relying on anything except for his own memory to tell his story. So just because it's later in time doesn't make it secondary. Still primary. So that brings us to the end of the main types of primary sources. I just want to remind you that after you're done viewing this lesson, you should complete the basic skill check on Canvas. You can retake it as many times as you need to in order to be able to get the minimum score of 70%. Of course, you can also just keep retaking it until you get 100% if you want. You are also able to use your notes on that, so don't feel like you have to just rely on your memory. If you have any questions, please send me an email, a Canvas message. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram. Whatever you got to do it, and I will help you out. Have a great day.